101st Airborne Division has been called the lightning of the U.S. Army. Using the speed and firepower of its helicopters, the division is a shock force, able to launch air assaults against targets behind enemy lines, then capture territory quickly with its own infantry troops and artillery.
It is absolutely unique. There's no organization in the world that can do what the 101st does. It can bring overwhelming combat power against a target very, very quickly. We can put many, many soldiers on the ground in very quick order. There's really no limit to how far we can go.
The division has nearly 300 helicopters, Kiowa Warriors, reconnaissance aircraft, Apaches for delivering deadly missile fire, Blackhawks for firepower and rapid transportation of troops, and giant Chinook cargo helicopters that can carry vehicles, artillery, and even a bulldozer. Strikes by the Screaming Eagles usually come as a total surprise to the enemy. The choppers fly with night vision at speeds of 200 miles an hour. They have the ability to jam enemy radar, and they can hit an unsuspecting foe from 5 miles away. As a helicopter division, the 101 can cross front lines unrestricted by terrain, as they have done from the jungles of Vietnam to the sands of Desert Storm.
Generals for the last 300 years have always said, you know, I got this flank and I got that flank. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to go over the top? Well, that's what the 101st does.
The helicopters are not just for firepower. They also deliver the division's infantry to the battlefield. One of the main jobs of the 19,000-strong division is to secure enemy territory and knock out resistance so that the heavy forces that follow behind, like the tanks and bombers, have a much clearer path. From its earliest days, the Screaming Eagles training has been legendary for its toughness. To earn their silver wings, division soldiers have to survive one of the Army's most rigorous programs. One aim, of course, is to get soldiers ready for combat behind enemy lines. But there's more to it than that. Ever since the division was formed during World War II, the Eagles' hallmarks have been fierce training and an even stronger pride in themselves.
I think it's the pride and the history behind this division, being all the campaigns it's contributed in through history, and just a great history and pride here. It's a very tough, unique division.
They believe their heritage, and they study their heritage, and they want to live up to their heritage, and they do live up to their heritage, and so they just don't settle for anything but best.
The Screaming Eagles' heritage has always meant striking quickly behind enemy lines. Today, the methods are high-tech. When the division was first formed during World War II, the method was jumping out of airplanes into Nazi Europe. The 101st Airborne, which was to play such a legendary role in World War II, did not even exist when the war began. Many top brass in the Army were skeptical about whether parachute troops would be of much use. But that quickly changed when Hitler's Germans used paratroopers to great effect in overrunning Europe. Soon, the U.S. Army had two of its own airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st. The 101 was earmarked for history on its very first day of existence in August 1942. Its commander, General Bill Lee, told the men in his opening speech, "The 101st has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny." For its symbol, the division looked back to the Civil War and to the famous Iron Brigade from Wisconsin, who always carried an eagle, Old Abe, into battle, even after Abe was wounded. The 101 would call themselves the Screaming Eagles. From the start, training was brutally tough. The Army wanted to find men who could fend for themselves after being dropped from an airplane behind enemy lines. Only 1 man in 3 survived the training regimen, which included a forced march of 140 miles in 3 days.
They also at one point went to a slaughterhouse and got truckloads of hog entrails and dumped on the ground, spread them out, and then we had to crawl through those with live machine gun fire 18 inches over the ground. We were absolutely physically fit. I don't think there's a man in there that wouldn't have taken on a gorilla if they put him out there with him.
The story at that time was that the way they ascertained that you were fit to be a parachutist was to put one doctor on each side of you looking in your ears. If they could see each other, you were in.
The Screaming Eagles were all volunteers. They joined to fight alongside the best, they said. And for the parachute pay, a bonus of $50 a month and $100 for officers.
Of course, I didn't realize at that time, and I did realize later, that $100 a month jump pay was blood money. I'll find that out later.
The paratroopers had to learn jumping until finally they were good enough to make 5 jumps from real planes, which earned them their silver wings.
Boy, when you got that 5th jump in and they pinned your wings on, you just felt like you could fly without wings. It was a most wonderful feeling.
By September 1943, the Screaming Eagles were in England, preparing for the Allied invasion of Europe. As an untried experimental unit, the 101 came under close scrutiny from wartime leaders, including the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Allied commander General Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was secretly anxious about the safety of the paratroopers. Some Allied generals were predicting 80% casualties in a drop against the Germans. Even a demonstration jump for the top brass proved dangerous.
They finally jumped us. We had one guy killed, Sergeant Sarber, and about 10% of the guys ended up in the hospital. And that was pretty sobering, but that was par for the course.
By June of 1944, the Screaming Eagles knew exactly what their mission would be. The Allies were planning a mass invasion of Europe to begin the task of pushing back Hitler's armies. The invasion would begin on the French coast in Normandy, and the Screaming Eagles would be among the first to go in. Under the plan, the bulk of the invasion force would arrive by ship along the Cherbourg Peninsula at the beaches codenamed Omaha and Utah. The airborne divisions would parachute in before them to take the German-held area behind the beaches so that the seaborne forces could move inland. It was a highly dangerous mission, and no one knew what to expect. The invasion date, D-Day, was set for June 6th. On the night of the 5th, nearly 6,700 Screaming Eagles checked their parachutes and prepared to board their planes. They were given a special dinner, a condemned man's last meal, one soldier called it, before heading out.
I remember they fed us pork chops and fried chicken, which was a real treat. As a matter of fact, we were eating chicken legs on the way up to our assigned C-47 troop ship.
The new division commander, General Maxwell Taylor, who'd replaced the ailing Bill Lee, promised the men, "Give me 3 days of hard fighting and you will be relieved." Eisenhower himself came down to the airfield. He didn't give a speech, but spoke one by one to hundreds of the men, wishing them luck. Then he stayed to watch as the paratroopers boarded their planes for what would be their first ever combat mission. Soon the world would know whether America's experiment with airborne troops would work or not. As Eisenhower gave a silent salute, the planes took off toward Hitler's Fortress Europe.
Most of us were thinking about, are we really going to be okay? You know, we think we're brave and all that sort of thing, but what are we really going to do when we know we're being shot at and that bullet's intended for us? And, you know, some very long thoughts going on.
You start to do a little praying, and you pray very sincerely because you're going into the unknown and you want to know, you doubt yourself. You're not sure in your own heart whether you can handle this.
Below them, in the English Channel, were 6,000 Allied vessels heading for Normandy.
It was the most fantastic scene that I've ever seen in my life. There was hardly a piece of water going over the coast that wasn't covered with a ship of some kind. And I looked down there and I thought, those guys are waiting for us. And if we don't make a successful landing, this is a failed operation.
As they crossed the coastline, some of the pilots yelled, "Say hello to France, boys," and they got ready to jump. The mission had been very precisely planned, and it was about to go completely wrong. On D-Day of the European invasion, all went according to plan for the 101st Airborne, until their transport planes crossed into France. Then German anti-aircraft fire started coming up, and many pilots panicked, disobeyed orders, and broke formation.
When we hit the coast of Normandy, all hell broke loose. The firing on the plane was, I mean, there was so much aircraft and ground fire that the pilots started taking evasive action immediately.
Instead of jumping from 700 feet at 100 miles an hour, many of the Screaming Eagle paratroopers had to jump from only 300 feet, from planes going 200 miles an hour.
Opening shock was that strong when you're doing about 200 miles an hour that the rope tore and there went all your equipment, so you lost everything.
They lost their rifles, they lost their sidearms. They pretty well came down with just maybe a grenade or two attached to their rings up there, and maybe a knife attached to their boot.
The carefully planned jump turned into chaos, with the men scattered all over Normandy. Many were dropped as far as 10 miles from their planned landing zones. Some were dropped into the English Channel and drowned, and others came down directly on top of German troops and were killed before they hit the ground.
I believe we lost close to 1,000 men, and so did the 82nd, on these men who never got back to their own units because they were dropped so far apart and so far from their designated drop zones.
Many found themselves alone, at night, in enemy-held territory, with little idea where they were.
I had a Tommy gun, a Thompson submachine gun, and I was on my stomach on the ground, and I let it burst when I saw some feet coming my way and no recognition signal. I gave a burst, and that poor cow was killed.
Barney Ryan and his colleagues were dropped into a neck-deep swamp, surrounded by Germans, and had to swim for their lives.
And so we all dropped back on our backs in the water, started paddling back, and we got separated. I never saw them again. And I tried to get out of that swamp 3 times during the night. Every time it made some noise, you'd be fired on. So I was right in the middle of a group of Germans.
He spent 3 days surrounded by Germans until American troops arrived and took the area. The Eagles had been trained to be resourceful behind enemy lines, and now it was paying off.
Paratroopers, by and large, felt they could be a one-man army. If they fell or jumped and were by themselves, they'd do what they could to fight their way back or get back to their unit.
To identify each other in the dark, the paratroopers were given children's toys, crickets.
The idea was that you challenged with one click, and the responded with 2 clicks. Now, why that was a good idea was that if you use words, it's very difficult to disseminate that, get it out to every man so that he knows it. It's hard for him to remember it. Some of them are going to forget it under the stress of combat and so forth.
But having crickets was no guarantee of knowing who was around the next hedgerow.
And I bumped into a body. And I spun around, and there was a little old Frenchman he was hiding there in the hedgerow, and I had my rifle right between his eyes, and he was chattering away, and I'm sure he was telling me he's not an enemy.
In case of capture, officers were given escape equipment, including a map of France, a saw, and a compass.
I took this map, folded it up, and sewed it in the lining of my trousers. And for the saw, I took the saw and I split the sole of my boot and put the saw between the soles of my boot. And for the compass, I put that in the fly of my pants.
Because of the scattered drop, soldiers had to create makeshift units as they went along. By the end of the first day, only 1 soldier in 3 had found his own unit. But the scattering had unexpected payoffs. Although it confused the American paratroopers, it confused the Germans even more.
Because it was so screwed up. It was so screwed up, the Germans didn't really know what the major mission was. They didn't know where to rush their main forces because we had men all over the whole peninsula.
You couldn't have planned reconnaissance better in a way, although you wouldn't have done it, than to have these chaps drop where they were and come back and tell us who they'd seen and where they had been and what they had done.
Because of the scattering, there were no defined front lines on the peninsula, so the initial fighting became a series of small unit actions.
A lot of it was combat in cities type of fighting, where they were in a group of houses, and in that case you just had to fire a bazooka into the house, mortar if you had mortar or whatever. So the kind of fighting was a function of where the enemy was and where you found him.
This kind of fighting played to the Eagles' advantage.
We were trained to take care of guerrilla-type fighting and small unit fighting. That had been basically our training. For the Germans, they were not trained as intensely as we were for this type of fighting.
For Richard Winters on D-Day, the main mission was to lead a dozen men in a raid to take out 4 huge German artillery guns that were pounding the Americans on Utah Beach, 3 miles away.
I charged with the rest of the guys, and we took the first trench. We captured the first gun. The tactic for something like that, if you're on their flank, you put down another base of fire on the next gun and charge that. Very basic, very simple, nothing unusual about it. We'd done this sort of thing in training, but we did this 4 times, and we took all 4 guns.
The effect was pivotal. The action virtually stopped the shelling of American forces coming ashore on Utah Beach.
It was only afterwards that we realized what we had done. At the time, we didn't realize that this was a key operation. It was just a job that had to be done.
At the end of the first day's fighting, division reinforcements began arriving by glider, bringing in men and anti-tank guns. But many of the gliders crash-landed, hitting trees and hedgerows. 19 soldiers were killed. Over the next 2 days of fighting, the 101 took control of its target areas behind Utah Beach. Now it was ordered to look south to take the town of Carentan, a vital crossroads of highways and railroads. Carentan was the key to controlling the whole peninsula, and the Germans had been ordered to defend it to the last man. Advancing on Carentan made the Eagles sitting ducks, because the causeways that led into town sat exposed above the surrounding marshes.
It was called Purple Heart Lane by a lot of our troopers, because they got them. They got their Purple Hearts there, if they survived.
I was shot in the chest on the right side. I felt something run out of my mouth. I guess it was blood. And a blanket that was around me was blown off. An arm reached across my chest, retrieved the blanket, and tucked it in all around me, very tenderly. And I managed to move my head to the right, and it was a German PW on the stretcher next to me. And I didn't say anything to him, and he didn't say anything to me, but our eyes sort of locked, and that's always kind of stayed with me all these years.
The Germans in Carentan threw everything they could at the Screaming Eagles as they approached the town, pounding them with heavy artillery. Colonel Robert Cole, whose men were pinned down by heavy fire on the edge of town, decided to lead a bayonet charge against a farmhouse that contained a nest of German machine guns.
One by one, the men got up with him and charged across his field, yelling like a bunch of Comanches. And I guess it sort of shook the Germans, and they just either bugged out or gave up or got killed, one of the three.
Of course, coming across this field, we were exposed to these men over here in the hedgerows here all the time, and they had us perfectly covered. So it was simply a matter of getting across the open ground as quickly as possible.
Colonel Cole's charge won him the Medal of Honor, but he never got to see it. 3 months later, as he scouted a battlefield in Holland, a sniper's bullet killed him.
Scattered up along the road here. And on the...
After 3 days of heavy fighting, the Screaming Eagles took Carentan, but then had to hunker down against a fierce German counterattack from tanks, artillery, and machine guns.
While we're in there fighting the Germans, they were in there and we were in there in close combat. We were being bombed. The city was being bombed. It was practically obliterated. And it was a scary thing.
We were just holding on with our fingers, just holding on, and not letting them push us back.
The 101st desperately held Carentan against the counterattack for 2 full days, until American artillery and armor arrived from the beach to help drive the Germans out. Then the Eagles and the other American forces linked up to gradually take control of the whole Cherbourg Peninsula. 1 month after they had landed, and not 3 days, as promised, the division's work in Normandy was complete. It had paid a heavy price. 1 in every 4 soldiers had been killed or wounded. But its first taste of battle had proven a triumph and justified General Eisenhower's faith in paratroopers. After their success in Normandy, the Screaming Eagles had a few weeks in England to rest and lick their wounds. But they knew it would not be long before they would have to jump again behind Nazi lines in Europe. In September 1944, the division took off for Holland and Operation Market Garden. American, British, and Polish paratroopers were to be dropped behind the German lines in Holland and take control of a highway running north to the Rhine River so that British tanks could sweep north and into Germany. As in Normandy, the Airborne's role was to lay out a carpet for the Allied forces coming in behind them. But the jump into Holland was very different from the one into Normandy. It was done in daylight, and it was done with precision. And this time, gliders played a much bigger part. More than 600 of them landed in Holland, bringing in nearly half the division. Landings could still be rough, but the flights brought in valuable men, jeeps, trailers, and howitzers. The 101's mission was to secure the area around the southern end of the highway, and within 2 days it did so. The Germans at first had been caught off guard. The Eagles captured several Dutch towns and the southern section of the highway. They also captured the spoils of war.
Several of my people had to crawl into the tank to see if they could loot something out of the tank, which was the normal thing for a GI to do. One of them got a hold of this flag with a swastika on it. This flag that I'm holding up here came out of that tank.
As they liberated towns in their area, the American paratroopers were given an ecstatic welcome from the Dutch, who'd been under Nazi occupation for 5 years. When the 101st entered the town of Eindhoven, they were swamped by grateful civilians. The American soldiers could not get the residents off the streets, but the Germans could.
The Germans moved a Tiger tank up on the other side of the canal and started firing, and it wasn't long before you couldn't see any Dutch people anyplace. They had disappeared indoors.
The Germans might have been surprised initially, but now the 101st knew they were in for a brutal struggle to keep open the 16 miles of highway under their watch. All told, the Allied paratroopers had to keep open 60 miles of road, and that became increasingly difficult as the Germans regrouped and pounded them with artillery. The soldiers soon renamed their stretch of road Hell's Highway.
It's the most frightening thing in the world because you can't go any place. You got to just stay there and take it. And you see guys being blown up all around you. And if one hits close to you, it'll actually lift you off the ground.
In one trench, Private Joe Mann sat with his arms bound up and useless after being wounded 4 times. Then he watched helplessly as a German grenade landed among him and 6 comrades.
Both his arms were in bandages, but he dove on it, yelled grenade, and laid up right on his back. He flopped right on the grenade and took the full blast from that grenade, and of course it killed him.
For his self-sacrifice, Private Joe Mann was awarded the Medal of Honor. For the Holland operation to work, the key element was speed. It was vital that the British tanks come up quickly from the south, but that didn't happen. They were delayed by heavy German fire and didn't link up with the Americans till late on the second day. Many of the Screaming Eagles felt the British had no sense of urgency. With the tank movement delayed, the British paratroopers, who jumped near the northern end of the highway near Arnhem, became easy prey for German tanks and artillery. In what became famous as the story of a bridge too far, 10,000 British paratroopers jumped north of the Rhine River, and only 1/4 of them made it back. Farther south, the battle for Hell's Highway began to bog down, and the Allies gradually realized that Operation Market Garden was not going to work. The Germans retreated from Hell's Highway, but they consolidated around Arnhem, blocking the Allied plans to break through into Germany. The 101st now hoped they would be relieved, but instead they were sent to the front line, below the Rhine near Arnhem. It was a static front, and the Eagles spent much of their time sitting in foxholes, a target once again for German artillery. The shelling, punctuated by fierce infantry fighting, dragged on for weeks, with neither side gaining any real ground. The Eagles had been told that the Holland campaign would be a 72-hour operation. By the time they left, they had been there for 72 days.
Being mortared and artillery fire, we lost our regimental commander. He got killed by a mortar, and lost a lot of good people and so forth. That's just a very poor use of airborne troops.
Finally, the division was pulled off the front line and sent for a much-needed rest to a camp in Mourmelon in France's Champagne province. Christmas was coming, and there were leave passes to Paris, and the talk of the camp was the interdivisional football game, the Champagne Bowl, to be played on Christmas Day, followed by turkey dinner and champagne. But neither the game nor the dinner was ever held. Adolf Hitler had other plans. On December 17th, word came down that the Germans had launched a huge offensive to the north in Belgium. They'd pushed the Allied front line back 65 miles, creating a bulge that would give its name to the ensuing battle. Allied commanders, taken completely by surprise, ordered all available troops to rush there to stem the tide.
About 4 o'clock in the morning, we were awakened and told that we were going to go on an operation. And I told the guys, well, they're full of shit. We can't go. We don't have any uniforms. Most of us have turned in our weapons. We don't have any ammunition. They're full of crap. Well, found out they weren't.
12,000 Screaming Eagles were loaded into trucks and driven north at high speed. Some did not even have time to collect their winter clothes or boots. The 101 was ordered to go to the town of Bastogne, where many of Belgium's major highways intersected. Hitler had declared it must be taken, and General Eisenhower had ordered that it must be held at all costs.
Dropped us off, and we started walking in, and we came past this little sign that said Bastogne. I didn't know where in the hell that was. I didn't even know what country it was in. But I remember saying to one of the guys, take a good look at that sign. We're going to make history here.
When the Screaming Eagles arrived in Bastogne to halt the German advance, they met Allied soldiers running the other way, fleeing the German surge and yelling, "They'll kill you all."
Bastogne is chaotic, really. There were so many jeeps rushing to the rear, and they couldn't get out fast enough. The corps headquarters was moving out as fast as they could.
The 101st got to Bastogne just ahead of the onrushing Germans. Now the problem was how to keep them out. The division units pushed outwards from the town to meet the Germans head-on and stop them from getting into Bastogne itself.
They did meet the Germans. They did stop the Germans. The Germans were really unprepared to have somebody coming at them. They'd been having people on the run ever since they started this thing on the 16th.
The division formed a perimeter around Bastogne and held it in the face of tremendous German fire. Al Hassensahl was on the front line when his close friend, Punchy Zetwich, was hit in the chest.
I said, Punchy, you're going to be all right. And he was hit. He was hit in just about the same place, as far as I could determine, as I was in Normandy. And Punchy said, no, Lieutenant, he said, I don't think so. And his face got that same pallor to it that you know when a guy is hit hard. And anyway, Punchy died in the half-track on the way back to the collecting company, division collecting company. And in 1994, when we visited at Ile Chapelle, the graves of our people, I found Punchy. And we talked.
The division perimeter around Bastogne held against the odds. But within 2 days, the superior German forces had completely surrounded the town and cut off all roads. The Screaming Eagles were now totally isolated, the hole in the donut, as one of them put it. They were sitting targets for German artillery.
You were peppered with anything from screaming Mimis to mortars to artillery fire. And once in a while, of course, if in your sector they put on an attack, you were under small arms fire.
Incoming fire was not the only problem. Men on the perimeter were living in foxholes without their winter gear in sub-zero temperatures.
We'd dig foxholes in the snow and hack it out as best we could, 2 men to a hole, to try and keep a little warmer.
You just lay down on the ground and sleep. Wrap up in your raincoat and sleep. I know people say you can't do that, but I'm telling you, you can.
Allied supply planes could not reach Bastogne because of the weather. leaving the troops short of food, fuel, and medical supplies. The division's medical situation was desperate.
They captured our entire division hospital, which we had thought was in a safe place, but they captured our surgeon, all the doctors, all the medical supplies and everything.
Medics had to dig their own hospital.
We were at foxholes just the same as everybody else in Bastogne, and we had to dig a hole in the ground for our aid station. We dug a hole in the ground about 5 feet by 8 feet by 4 feet deep, and that was our aid station.
Those guys are heroes because they went above and beyond what I would consider the call of duty. They did whatever they could for those guys, but there's very little you can do. Many of them just died of shock or froze to death.
Yet despite all the hardships, the Screaming Eagles remained confident. The Germans, with all their advantages, were unable to break the perimeter.
We didn't think that the Krauts had the upper hand. Somebody said the poor bastards, they had us surrounded.
The Eagles might have been surrounded, but surrender was out of the question, as the Germans were about to find out. By the 5th day of the siege of Bastogne, December 22nd, the Germans assumed the Americans had had enough. They sent 2 officers into Bastogne with a letter from the German commander, strongly suggesting that the division give up.
We read the message, and it demanded that we surrender, and if we didn't, a lot of bad things were going to happen to the 101. We went into General McAuliffe. He at first thought that this was Germans wanting to surrender to us, and we disabused him of that very quickly and said, no, they're demanding our surrender. To which General McAuliffe said, us surrender? Oh, nuts. I mean, he thought, we're giving them a shellacking. Why should we surrender? So he just said, oh, nuts. And then General McAuliffe said, well, I don't know what to tell them. And being a smart-aleck colonel, I piped up and said, well, what you first said would be hard to beat. He said, what do you mean? I said, you said nuts. And everybody nodded his head up and down and thought that was a good idea. So he wrote to the German commander, nuts, exclamation. AC, commanding general, 101st, gave it to Bud Harper. Bud Harper took it back to where the Germans were still blindfolded in the company headquarters. He said to the German, I have the answer, I'll put it in your hand. And the German said, is it affirmative or negative? He said, it's decidedly negative, it's nuts. And the guy said, Neuss, was ist das? He couldn't comprehend what this could be. And Bud Harper said, well, in plain English, it means go to hell.
McAuliffe's reply was cheered by the men, who felt exactly the same way about the notion of surrender.
That subject never came up. We never talked about it. We never thought about it. It was never considered. We had confidence in ourselves, and this is no exaggeration. We had confidence in ourselves. There was no thought of being overrun.
Besides, I knew if I surrendered, when I got in the German prisoner of war camp, all they're going to feed me is turnip soup, and I hate turnips.
The Germans resumed their attack on the Bastogne perimeter, but they made a fatal tactical error. They attacked only one section at a time, and each time they were met by the full force of the American artillery inside, which included artillery units that stayed behind in Bastogne with the 101. It made the Germans think the American arsenal was much stronger than it was.
We had interior lines, you see, and could move quickly, and the massing of artillery was very, very important to be able to shift those fires to wherever we were threatened.
We would have been in deep doo-doo had the Germans attacked simultaneously all the way around the perimeter. But they chose to hit certain areas.
The Germans fired more than shells. Their guns also sent in fake Christmas cards, again urging the Americans to surrender. But just before Christmas, there was a break in the weather, and Allied bombers flew over and pounded German positions, taking some of the heat off Bastogne. Even more welcome were the resupply planes. They brought in much-needed ammunition, but still left the 101 with some serious shortages. Gasoline and medical supplies were at a low ebb, and there was still not nearly enough rations to make Christmas dinner a merry one. The feast was crackers and sardines for the officers and bean soup for those in the foxholes. It was on December 26th that the Screaming Eagles finally got their belated Christmas present. The 4th Armored Division from General Patton's army broke through the German positions south of Bastogne and reached the 101st. The siege was finally over.
I'll tell you, those guys who were up in the front lines were really spooked out. And when the tanks actually came right up to their positions, that tank commander had to call out to them, "Hey, we're friendlies."
With the siege over, the men could finally get food and medical supplies, and also mail, although that could be a mixed blessing.
I was sitting on a log in the snow up to my ass, and I got a letter from the Internal Revenue Service. It said I owed them $128, and if I didn't pay it, they'd put me in jail. So I took a bunch of money from Belgian and French money that I had and put it in an envelope and wrote a letter and said, "If you'll promise me you'll put me in jail, by God, come on and get me." And I never heard a word after that.
They didn't know it, but the men of the 101 had become world famous as the battered bastards of Bastogne. And even Hitler told his commanders he'd like to see a German general who'd fight with such resistance when the situation appeared hopeless. But Hitler himself had not given up. The siege was over, but the battle for Bastogne and the rest of the Bulge went on. The Screaming Eagles joined the American 1st and 3rd Armies in the fight to push the Germans back. By mid-January of 1945, the American armies had driven the Germans back towards their own border. The Battle of the Bulge was over. In Bastogne, the American 7th Corps commander, General Middleton, called the 101 the finest division he'd ever known. But before handing the town over to General Middleton, the Eagles made him sign a receipt which said, "Received from the 101st Airborne, the town of Bastogne, Belgium. Condition, used but serviceable. Kraut disinfected." After some border patrol duty in Alsace, the division returned to camp in France, where General Eisenhower created a precedent by awarding the entire division the Distinguished Unit Citation. "You met every test," he told them, "and I am awfully proud of you." In April 1945, the Screaming Eagles were sent into Germany itself and found that the German army, so recently a feared enemy, was giving itself up en masse.
It was kind of scary in a way, because here you got, sometimes there'd be 500 of them and come into one guy and want to surrender, and you just take them in.
In Germany, the division unexpectedly came upon evidence of why it had been fighting the Nazis. In the town of Landsberg, the 101 entered a concentration camp that had been liberated the day before by the 10th Armored Division.
Soldiers who were used to almost everything were literally sick and vomiting and whatnot at the corpses and the stench and everything going on.
The division ordered the town's German civilians to grab shovels and help bury the dead.
One kid, maybe not 15-year-old, gave the Heil Hitler salute, and one of my sergeants booted his butt right into the open pit with all the bodies.
The division's target was the Alpine village of Berchtesgaden, where Hitler kept his fortified retreat, the Eagle's Nest. By the time the 101 reached Berchtesgaden, there was little resistance. Hitler was dead in Berlin, and the official German surrender was only a day away. The soldiers were free to enter Hitler's villa. The Eagle's Nest was now the domain of the Screaming Eagles.
Walking into the Eagle's Nest was like walking into a wonderful set that Hollywood might conceive. I mean, if there was anything that you could wish for from a view to the house itself to being one of a kind, totally unique, it was the Eagle's Nest. My own feeling was it was much too good for him.
This is what you've been fighting for. You've reached it. This is your goal. This is victory. It's the end of the war. Walking into a bunker, and it was near his quarters, and seeing the lights on the switchboard, that has left an impression. You're hot on the trail when the lights in the switchboard to headquarters are still on.
The victorious troops souvenired everything that wasn't nailed down and made successful raids on Hitler's wine cellar, which came in very handy on Armistice Day. Hitler's armored staff cars were requisitioned as jeeps, and soldiers used their machine guns to prove that they weren't totally bulletproof. The nearby villas of other Nazi big shots were also looted. From the closets of Hitler's deputy, Hermann Goering, came comprehensive trophies of underwear. Boxer shorts weren't Goering's only collectibles. The 101 oversaw the recovery of precious art treasures looted for Goering by German troops across Europe. The stash included works by Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and Renoir. Soldiers also discovered famous Nazis hiding in the surrounding mountains. Among those arrested were Julius Streicher, the notorious anti-Semite propagandist, and Dr. Robert Ley, leader of the Nazi Labor Front.
Officers, especially the officers that had Jewish background, and they knew what had happened to their people, they really hunted them down.
During the summer of '45, the Screaming Eagles returned to camp in France to await a possible jump into Japan, although the Hiroshima bomb ended that possibility. With no missions left to make, the war was over for the division, and it was deactivated. The 101st Airborne no longer existed, officially anyway. It was already a permanent part of those who had served.
The 101 unquestionably was as fine a division as the Army's ever fielded in any war. And to be a part of it and engage a real live enemy in that unit was wonderful. War is hell, but if you got to be in war, you want to be with a unit like the 101.
I still love those guys, and when you are in an outfit like that and live and fight as we did, you're as closer than you are to your own wife. You're stripped of all pretense.
I get choked up. Wonderful bunch of guys.
Looking at pictures of the men, I think of looking at men that are satisfied. They're satisfied within themselves. He's not swaggering. To swagger is to become a hero. No, these fellows aren't swaggering. They're satisfied.
The Screaming Eagles had seen only 1 year of action, but what a year it had been. And they had written their names into history. When America next called upon the 101st to fight a war, the paratroopers would again go behind the lines of a dangerous enemy in Vietnam. After being disbanded at the end of World War II, the 101st Airborne was reactivated as a full division in 1956 to meet the potential threats of the Cold War. There was even talk at one point of having to jump into Cuba. But instead, the division's first major action would take place on the other side of the world. In 1965, the Screaming Eagles were sent to fight a kind of war they'd never experienced in the dense mountain jungles of Vietnam.
It was, in some areas, so dark that you could hardly see, especially early in the morning, late in the afternoon. It was extremely humid, and on most days would exceed 100 degrees. We were covered with leeches 2 and 3 inches long, if we were hacking our way through bamboo.
Vietnam was two separate countries, North and South, and the South, an American ally, was under increasing attack from the Communist North. In 1965, President Johnson ordered combat forces to South Vietnam to help defend it. And one of the first units sent was the Screaming Eagle's 1st Brigade, about 3,600 of the division's best troops. As an airborne division, the 101st was an obvious choice because Vietnam would be the first great helicopter war. For the American forces, helicopters were the trump card that could overcome the inaccessibility of the jungle and deliver both firepower and troops with a mobility never seen before.
They could attack, move, be in place again as the enemy moved on, whereas the enemy had to hump through the jungle. So they didn't have that advantage. So we could put fresh troops in fairly easily and keep them fairly fresh without them having long hikes through the jungle.
The Screaming Eagles rarely parachuted in Vietnam. The dense jungle made that impractical. Instead, the helicopters dropped them directly onto the landing zones, or LZs, and frequently the drops and pickups were met by enemy ground fire.
Yes, it's dangerous. Anytime you're up there, you could be shot at with a rocket or a surface-to-air missile or machine guns.
Somebody once quoted to me that the life expectancy of a helicopter pilot in a hot LZ was about 11 seconds. And there were a few times I was clicking them off and saying, we got to be to 15 by now. We got to get out of here.
Helicopters gave the 101st tremendous maneuverability. And as a result, the division got to see a lot of Vietnam very quickly. The Eagles used their helicopter mobility to make as many rapid search and destroy missions as they could in enemy territory.
The choppers would come in an hour later, pick us up, drop us to another area. We would make 4 to 6 combat assaults like that in a day. We called them Eagle flights. We were fast, mobile. We could do a lot of things that the other units couldn't do. We were trained to do that.
Unlike World War II, there was no front line in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Army and its civilian soldiers, the Viet Cong, were masters at hide-and-seek guerrilla warfare. There were frequent clashes in Vietnam, many of them small-scale. But some battles escalated into firefights that could last for days, like the battle near Dak To in 1966, that raged for 2 weeks until the Eagles prevailed. In battles like Dak To, just as their colleagues had at Bastogne, the division soldiers took enormous pride in the Screaming Eagle patch on their shoulders. So much so that when the Army ordered all units in Vietnam to tone down their shoulder patches for camouflage reasons, the 101st was made an exception because the patch made them better soldiers.
And there's definitely something about wearing that Screaming Eagle on your shoulder, at least that I find, like something mystical about it. It's a talisman and an inspiration.
The Eagle patch became famous among the North Vietnamese.
They respected us. They called us chicken men. They didn't know what an eagle was. And they said, watch out for the chicken men.
Because the enemy was often so hard to find, the Eagles and other divisions developed special teams to go into enemy areas on intelligence missions. The teams were called Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrols, or LRPs.
Our main function was to be the eyes and the ears of the 101st Airborne Division. That was our motto, matter of fact.
LRP patrols, usually 6-man teams, were dropped by helicopter into enemy territory for 3 to 7 days to locate enemy positions and then get out before they were spotted themselves. For the LRPs, silence was golden.
We all learned to use hand signals. There was no talking at all on alert patrol. Sometimes we would go 5 or 6 days, and except for a whisper when the radio operator was calling in a situation report, there was no talking at all.
Most LRP patrols were looking only for information, but sometimes heavily armed LRP teams of a dozen men would lay ambushes for the enemy, then get out quickly by helicopter. Gary Linderer was on one such mission in 1968 that ambushed an enemy patrol by using claymore mines.
5 claymores went off and killed 9 of the 10 people that were in that patrol. 4 of them were nurses, and which immediately bothered me when we found out, but 3 of the nurses had .45 automatics on them.
Now, the Eagle team needed helicopters immediately to take them out, but headquarters said there were none available, and the LRP team had to sit and wait for the inevitable enemy counterattack. It came. Mines exploded right under the Americans.
When the smoke cleared, I looked up and there was nobody left. Everybody was down. I was hit. Everybody else on the team was down. I didn't see anybody else up. A few seconds went by, and Riley Cox, one of the guys on the team, sat up across the perimeter, and his intestines fell out in his lap when he sat up. His arm was broken just below his elbow and dangling. I saw him take his towel that he had around his neck and shove his intestines back in his stomach and put the towel in place to hold them in.
The LRP team's fate now depended on getting reinforcements quickly. And when 2 helicopters flew into an Eagle base camp to pick up volunteers, the whole camp tried to pile into the choppers.
And we had to kick people off and say, no, you can't go. We can't take off. One guy had a cast on his leg and was supposed to have gone home and was told to get off, and he stroked the charging handle on his weapon and said, no, sir. And so somebody else was selected to get off instead of him.
Back at the battle zone, helicopter gunships rocketed enemy positions, while the reinforcements tried to get to the wounded who were still trying to fight.
Riley started jacking shells left-handed into this pump shotgun and firing at one arm down the hill at the enemy. So he was still able to fight. Basically, there was only 2 or 3 of us that could still shoot at that point in time.
It took a whole day's fighting before the LRP team could be pulled to safety.
It was about 9:30 at night when we finally got the last of them out, and we were still taking heavy fire on every trip in and out.
4 of the 12 LRPs were killed, and all the others injured, as were 6 of the reinforcement team. Riley Cox survived and won the Silver Star, as did Gary Linderer and 6 other team members. 2 others won the Distinguished Service Cross. By early 1968, the entire 101st Division had been sent to Vietnam to join their 1st Brigade. Straight after they arrived, they were caught in the famous Tet Offensive, when the Viet Cong launched simultaneous countrywide attacks against American and South Vietnamese targets. The Tet Offensive shocked Washington, and American public sentiment against the war increased. On the battlefield, the soldiers knew it.
The thing that hurts the most with me is not having the support for their troops over there, and those people that were supporting the North Vietnamese with comments and so forth. That hurts.
As part of the post-Tet counteroffensive, the 101st was ordered to strike enemy strongholds in the rugged Ashaw Valley. On one sweep of the valley in May of 1969, Screaming Eagle units came upon a hill marked on their maps as numbered 937. It was heavily entrenched with North Vietnamese troops.
They had interlacing, mutually supporting, dug-in positions all the way up that hill. Most defended position I saw in my 3.5 years in Vietnam.
After the fighting that followed, it would forever be known as Hamburger Hill. This film, taken immediately after the remote battle, gives some idea of the firepower used. American bombers wiped out nearly all vegetation, but were unable to dislodge the entrenched defenders. Screaming Eagle infantry units were ordered to charge the hill in waves for a week, but they too could not dislodge the enemy.
We got to the base of the hill, and as we moved out, it was just open ground. Just stumps, bomb craters. As we're going up the mountain, I mean, just unbelievable machine gun fire. Now I know what the fellows on D-Day, as they were going across the beaches, we had no cover. The bombers and artillery had flattened every bit of cover that we had. And this time it had started to rain. And this clay they have just turned to mud. It was like grease. As you're trying to get up the hill, you're pulling on stumps, roots, rocks, anything you can grab, and you're sliding backwards. And all you could see was hands and arms coming up, throwing grenades at us. And machine guns. Just, there's no way I can explain to you what it was like.
8 hours after Tom McGall's unit began its assault, they were given the order to withdraw. Tom had been shot in the hip, but still carried other wounded back with him, and was given the Distinguished Service Cross. With mounting casualties of their own, the North Vietnamese finally abandoned the hill after 10 days of fighting.
Someone stuck a sea ration carton up on the top, said, "Welcome to Hamburger Hill." I was glad that it was taken. The cost was just too high.
Taking the hill had cost 400 American casualties. In Tom McGall's company, casualties were almost beyond belief.
I know this sounds extraordinary, but between people that were wounded and reinforced with new people, and with the KIAs, it was 150%. It was unbelievable.
Yet within a week of being won, Hamburger Hill was abandoned by the American commanders.
We knew what was going to happen on every operation that we went into the jungle. You found the enemy, you destroyed them, you went to another location.
The Hamburger Hill battle was a crystallizing point in the war. There was outrage in Congress and among the public about the waste of American soldiers' lives. The 101 and other units were winning their battles, but they would not be allowed to stay and win the war. Within the 101st Division in Vietnam, no group was more respected than the quiet band of heroes, the medics. Treating and extracting the wounded from the dense jungle was a fearsome and dangerous problem. And here again, the helicopter created a battlefield revolution. Medivac crews could extract the wounded from the jungle and race them to hospitals in ways unthought of just 20 years earlier.
I was wounded in Germany in World War II at 8 o'clock in the morning, and after 4 different ambulances, I was operated on in Luxembourg City at 8 o'clock that night. Unheard of in the Vietnam War. The reason why we saved so many people who were badly wounded in the Vietnam War was because of the helicopter.
As you fly along, if the doors are open, which they usually are, a lot of the blood gets splattered around inside the whole compartment of the aircraft. And it's shocking, you know, the every time that I ever picked up a patient, and it's heart-wrenching.
Fred Behrens was flying a Medivac mission in 1971 when his helicopter was shot down in the Ashaw Valley.
In the process of getting shot down, my crew chief was killed, and we got got down on the ground. Everybody exited the aircraft.
Behrens and his team hid out in enemy territory, where American Cobra attack helicopters were making strafing runs.
And this one Cobra made a run and ran over us and wounded our on-the-job training crew chief, and it mortally wounded him, and it hit me a few times.
Behrens survived, but then was shot in the arm by an enemy sniper. With his only remaining colleague, Behrens tried to crawl through the jungle to safety.
I'd been shot through both legs and my arm, so I only had one arm to push myself with, and finally I told Malo that I couldn't go and keep up with him, and he'd been shot once.
Alone now, Behrens heard the happy sound of an American patrol coming his way and yelled out for help.
I also yelled out that if they were where it sounded like they were, to watch out because there was a bunker. And then at that time, the North Vietnamese opened up on them and killed them all.
Alone again, he now hid amid a pile of logs to escape detection. That's when an American fighter plane bombed the area.
The bombs went off on both sides of me, blew me and my three little logs up in the air, and loaded my back up with steel.
Finally, 3 days after his chopper had crashed, he was found by an American patrol. And the first thing he asked for was water.
One of the reasons I survived and didn't bleed to death after being shot 5 times was the fact that I dehydrated from not having water. So as I was drinking this water, I was rehydrating, and I was starting to bleed all over the place again.
By the time he left Vietnam, Fred Behrens had won the Distinguished Flying Cross 3 times. For many medics in Vietnam, braving enemy fire to save the wounded meant paying the ultimate price.
You know, happiness expands, but grief focuses on one person in war. At least it does for me. Galen Griffin. He was a medic from Headquarters Company. One guy was wounded. Galen got up to go to his aid, and he was killed. Every name on that wall is sort of like Galen's name to me. Yeah, he had the fatal flaw of all the medics. When someone was hit, someone yells medic, you get up and run and help. So that's bravery. That's what it amounts to.
By the early 1970s, America had begun its withdrawal from an unpopular war. The Screaming Eagles were the last division to leave the combat zone. They were pulled out in 1972, and 3 years later, North Vietnam finally overran the South and created a single country. The 101st had fought the battles they were asked to fight and won them. But they came home to a country where many civilians seemed to blame the soldiers for losing the war.
You know, tactically, the U.S. won, but we lost the war at home psychologically. And I think that's a sad part, because soldiers were doing what they've always done.
It's like, well, I don't know, winning every round of a prize fight, but then at the 15th round, they say, okay, fight's over, you go home. And that's what it amounted to. Is I summarized Vietnam as we didn't lose, we left.
17 Screaming Eagles had won the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. The division had suffered twice as many casualties as it had in World War II. Yet many soldiers were vilified at home because of the unpopularity of the war.
I wore my uniform proudly. I went into a bar and I got heckled. And I was spit on. It was calling me a baby killer, a murderer, and other words that I cannot say. If I could have, I would have fought, but of course there was too many people there, and it was just a disgrace for me. So I left. I never went to the place again.
For the men of the 101st, however, a comforting factor was the eagle they wore on their shoulder.
I'm still proud. You know, I still realize that the 101st Airborne Division is probably the finest military unit in the history of the United States, and I feel like I was in one of its best units. So I'm very proud of that.
It would be nearly 20 years before the Screaming Eagle Division would see major combat again. And this time, they would return home as conquering heroes, hailed by a proud public. The 101st Airborne had won fame in the snows of Europe and the jungles of Vietnam. And in 1990, it faced yet another kind of hostile environment in the deserts near the Persian Gulf. In August that year, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his army, the world's fourth biggest field army, to invade Kuwait, Iraq's oil-rich neighbor to the south. When Saddam rejected all demands that he withdraw, Western nations, under the UN flag, began a massive military buildup nearby in Saudi Arabia. The initial aim of Operation Desert Shield was to prevent the Iraqi army from threatening any more Middle Eastern nations. The second aim, if Saddam refused to budge from Kuwait, was to begin Operation Desert Storm, to drive Iraq out by force. One of the first units sent to Saudi Arabia was the 101. Its attack helicopters made it a premier rapid response force. And the choppers would also be important anti-tank weapons if Iraq launched another offensive. The Screaming Eagles set up camp in the desert, which would turn out to be their home for the next 6 months.
In the middle of the day, the desert temperatures were 128 degrees, so you had this enormous heat early on. Late fall and early winter, you had just the opposite extreme. We were wearing parkers, and it was freezing cold weather.
Another problem was the sand. The American media were full of stories that the division's new attack helicopter, the Apache, would not work in the desert.
There certainly were some concerns. Could the helicopter survive? We had 2 desert sandstorms. The desert term is shamal, that blew through. These really affected the flying, shut down our ability to fly. I mean, you could not see 3 feet in front of you. Yet as soon as those shamals blew through, our soldiers quickly cleaned out their engines, flushed them with water, and they got back up flying and picked up the momentum.
There was also the psychology factor for the Screaming Eagles. Saddam Hussein was threatening to use chemical and biological weapons against the Americans, and the soldiers were not sure what kind of war to expect.
As first contact with that environment, you have a lot of anxiety. You are unsure about what's going to happen.
But the Screaming Eagles draw inspiration from their proud history, and they were given a big morale boost at Christmas as they awaited an uncertain war.
From the old heroes of World War II, every soldier got a Christmas gift. The bond there is power, and I don't know how the soldiers could have felt more confident than they did that day.
As the weeks passed, war became ever more likely. Iraq showed no signs of leaving Kuwait by the United Nations deadline of January 15, 1991. And the Screaming Eagles steeled themselves for war.
The soldiers were ready to go into battle. A common expression in those days preceding the commencement of the ground war was the way home is through Iraq.
January 15th arrived with the Iraqi army still in Kuwait. This meant war, and the Screaming Eagles would fire the first shots. Hours after the deadline passed, 8 of the Screaming Eagle's Apache helicopters flew into Iraq to eliminate radar systems. The Apaches flew in at night and found the radar station by using advanced night vision.
It basically sees by differentiating heat from one object in its surroundings. And a living being, particularly a human, show up extremely well in the desert because all their surroundings are the same temperature, but the living object stands out because of its heat.
The Apaches flew in undetected because of their radar jamming technology and launched their Hellfire missiles at the radar station.
One for you, Saddam.
You can see the confusion of the people running around on the ground. They don't have a clue where it's coming from. And that's the beauty of the Apache. We can see them and strike them from a great distance. Many times they couldn't even hear us. We can see objects 5-6 miles away. And with our Hellfire system, we can strike them at those ranges also with precision.
By knocking out the radar station, the division cleared the way for Allied bombers to make their devastating sorties against Iraqi troops and installations. After a month of bombing to soften up the enemy, the Allied commander Norman Schwarzkopf ordered the start of the ground war, sending troops into Iraq and Kuwait. The 101st mission was to fly deep into enemy territory and set up operating bases for further assaults. The first mission was to set up a forward base in Iraq named Cobra. The division's 1st Brigade air assaulted into the area with attack helicopters, peppering the Iraqi defenders on the ground.
And they put up a fight initially, but the overwhelming application of superior combat power from our attack helicopters, from artillery, and from close air support won the day. And that battalion, in fact, was severely damaged and surrendered.
As the division quickly supplied the new Cobra base using ground convoys and transport helicopters, the Eagle's 3rd Brigade began the longest air assault in history, flying 155 miles from its base in Saudi Arabia up to the Euphrates River in Iraq. There it took control of Highway 8, one of the main links between Baghdad and the Iraqi army.
And I thought to myself that night as we went in, we were only 100 miles from Baghdad, and we were on the ground. We had a brigade-sized element on the ground, and I wondered if Saddam knew we were there. And I thought to myself, he won't sleep very well at night if he knows the Americans are a mere 100 miles from Baghdad.
The Allied forces were rapidly overrunning the Iraqi positions. On the 4th day of the ground war, the Eagle's 2nd Brigade swung east from Base Cobra to set up a new base, Viper, from which it launched attacks against Iraqis retreating from the city of Basra.
A highway there up in the Basra area called the Highway of Death. And it was along that highway that attack helicopters from the 101st destroyed many, many Republican guards and other military units, vehicles, and maneuver formations.
Iraqis began surrendering en masse, which created the extraordinary situation of whole Iraqi units trying to surrender to a single helicopter.
It's a 2-seat aircraft, and when 40 or 50 people surrender to you, there's nowhere to put them. So basically, pilots would land and say, that way to the friendly lines, keep your hands up, and they'll take care of you. We couldn't do anything for them.
There's a feeling of pity for them. We felt sorry for them because they were just snatched up off the street and forced to live inhumane conditions. They had nothing more than a suitcase with some personal belongings in it, and the Iraqi military issued them a weapon and ammunition and put them in a hole.
The 101st was planning to go still deeper into Iraq when the ceasefire was announced. Victory had come barely 100 hours after the ground war had begun. For its part, the 101 had achieved all its objectives while losing only 5 soldiers. The Allied commander, General Schwarzkopf, singled out the division for special praise, calling it the lightning in Desert Storm.
And he's right. And it's because we can strike so quickly, so deep, with such awesome precision and lethality. That's what we did for him, the theater commander in Desert Storm, and that is a perfect description of what the 101st was in that combat operation.
The Desert Storm warriors returned home as national heroes, and that helped lay to rest some of the demons still haunting Vietnam veterans. At one homecoming, Tom Taylor remembers seeing a Vietnam veteran hold up a sign to his fellow Screaming Eagles.
Thank you, troops of Desert Storm, for bringing us back home. Home at last, from a war long past, home from Vietnam. The triumph of the Screaming Eagles in the Gulf was our vicarious triumph recognition.
As a strike force, the 101st Airborne Division is in a constant state of readiness. It can have its lead elements ready to fight anywhere in the world within 36 hours. Since Desert Storm, the Screaming Eagles have served in Haiti, Somalia, Panama, and the Balkans. An attack force like the 101 depends on having superior technology, and that's just what it has with the Apache helicopter. Equipped to fly unseen and unheard into enemy space, the Apache can deliver a lethal barrage of missile and rocket fire. All of this firepower is so computerized that the Apache pilots can control it with a mere turn of the head. The pilots have high-tech helmets which control the movement of the chopper's electronic eyes. That means that wherever the pilot looks, the electronic eyes look too, giving the pilot detailed computerized information about the battlefield he's looking at.
When a pilot looks to the right or looks to the left, these sensors sending energy through these detectors, through this cable into the computer, moves the sight with the pilot's helmet.
And it's not just the electronic eyes that move in sync with the pilot's helmet. So do the guns and Hellfire missiles. This means that to strike at a target, all the pilot has to do is look at it and fire.
There's a lot less thought involved in targeting an object, whatever it might be, and actually pulling a trigger. Because all I have to do is look at it, and there's a crosshair already. I look at the object, center it in my field of view, the crosshairs are on it, and I pull the trigger. It's that simple.
The division's edge in technology includes communications, vital for coordinating complex attacks between helicopters, infantry, and artillery.
One of the capabilities we have is a quick fix. Our aircraft are able to jam, intercept, and collect information on the enemy. And most recently at the National Training Center, we had an opportunity to be quite successful at this. Our folks had gone down on a frequency that the enemy was using, and listening to the OPFOR, they were able to determine the OPFOR had eyes on our Apaches coming through a certain pass, and they were preparing to set up a kill sack for them. And with this quick fix, overhearing it, sent right down to the Apache unit commander that trouble is impending, and so they were able to turn them around and send them a different route and save their lives.
Although high-tech weaponry is essential to keeping the battlefield advantage, the heart of the Screaming Eagles is still the foot soldier. History has shown that wars can't be won from the air alone. Soldiers have to claim the ground itself. Although today's infantry arrive in battle by helicopter instead of by parachute, the 101 infantry have a job that's not so different from the Eagles of old, who jumped into Normandy.
So once you get off that means of transportation into combat, you, the infantrymen, are into your fire team and squad level operations where you are relying upon yourselves. it gets back down to the same fundamental skills of fire, maneuver, having an overwatch, throwing a smoke grenade, and then bounding across the street.
Get all the way to the top. Then and only then can you place your legs on the beams, take your hands off the rope, and grab onto the beam.
Certainly, the infantry training hasn't gotten any easier since 1942. Anyone wanting to earn their wings has to complete a grueling regimen known as the 10 toughest days in the Army.
Basically looking for 110% motivation. If the soldiers are motivated at all times, they're going to make it in. Well, the first thing about being Screaming Eagle is being able to go up in the helicopter above the ground, and this is where it starts. They need to be able to overcome their fear of heights. And if they can't do this right here, we can't expect them to be able to jump out of those helicopters.
Fear of heights, both climbing up them and rappelling off them, is the main worry for new recruits.
Come down a rope on a 34-foot tower. That's quite an experience.
Yeah, the height's bothering right now, but the right-hand brake can't start it.
When they start rappelling, the hardest thing for the soldiers is that initial bound when they come off the tower and the initial bound. That is the hardest thing. Once they do that, clear that, they're good to go after that, but talking them through that initial bound is their hardest part.
You can up to 1 minor, a little more extension on your brake off.
Training is constant for the whole division, because in 36 hours, they could find themselves on any battlefield in the world against any type of enemy.
And so as we go into the future, we carry on the traditions of the great heroes of Bastogne and Market Garden. Being a member of the 101st is being a member of the varsity. They're on the first team. Just the sight of the patch is enough to motivate them. Because it's a one-of-a-kind organization, it's truly a national treasure for the United States military. And I think it's safe to say it's indispensable to the United States military.
What began as a risky experiment involving men with parachutes has evolved into a complex and lethal military machine that's proven itself against all types of enemies in all types of conditions. The Screaming Eagles of the 101st Airborne have kept the promise made by their very first commander. They have kept their rendezvous with destiny.